the prediction was that in 10 years from 1972, cancer would no longer be an issue for Americans. The irony is that the rate of cancer then was about 1 out of 7, maybe 1 out of 8. And so if you look at just that number, you can clearly see how this war on cancer, just failed.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey, Holistic Hilda here. This is episode 226, and our guest is Dr. Tom Cowan. Dr. Cowan is the Vice President of the Physicians Association for Anthroposophical Medicine, and he's a founding board member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. He is the author of many books, and his latest is Cancer and the New Biology of Water. In the book, he challenges our approach to cancer over the past 50 years. Today, he explains what the approach has been exactly and why it has failed us. He unpacks how cancer develops, he explains cell structure and tumor growth, and he basically spends a lot of time turning old paradigms on their head, and he dives deep behind the science of cancer. He also gives us practical suggestions for what to do to keep our bodies balanced and well. Hold on to your hats because we are going to geek out with Tom Cowan, and it will be well worth the ride. Before we dig in, I want to remind you that there's a quick and easy way to learn the basics of the Wise Traditions lifestyle. It's not complicated, and it's entirely satisfying and gratifying to eat and live as our ancestors did. So click on the link for the free 7 easy lessons in the show notes. And a shout out to our sponsor, Ancestral Supplements. This episode is brought to you in part by grass-fed liver and bone marrow by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements makes New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, liver, and bone marrow in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. I take the liver every day, and I love it. So check them out at ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Tom.
Thank you for having me on your show again.
I noted in your book that you mentioned an article from Newsweek from 2018 that said that today 1 in 3 people will get cancer during the course of our lifetime. That's an alarming statistic.
Yeah, I mean, you get all kinds of statistics. I've heard anything from 1 out of 2 to 1 out of 4. I guess it depends which types of cancer, like whether you count skin cancers or whatever. But the irony of this is, I keep referring in the book to the inauguration or the founding of the war on cancer in 1971-72. And, the prediction at that time was that now that we knew the cause of cancer, we would be able to devise strategies to prevent and treat it within 10 years. The prediction was that in 10 years from 1972, cancer would no longer be an issue for Americans. The irony is that the rate of cancer then was about 1 out of 7, maybe 1 out of 8. And so if you look at just that number, you can clearly see how this war on cancer, just failed.
Absolutely. And so is it that we need a new approach? Like, why is it taking over? Why is it spreading at such an alarming rate?
Well, yes, we need a new approach. And that was sort of what I wrote the first part of the book about. The whole idea that we found the cause and now we know what to do about it turns out to be basically in error. As my editor proposed to me, we put in the line, we bet the farm on a theory. The theory was wrong, and now we don't have a farm.
Yeah, I saw that in there. So that theory was that if we could identify the genetic mutation that causes cancer, then we can address it.
Correct. In 1971, we discovered something called oncogenes, which means genes that cause cancer. The official name is the somatic mutation theory, because somatic refers to humans have 46 chromosomes. Each species has their own unique number of chromosomes. They're always in pairs. There's somatic chromosomes, and then there's sex chromosomes. So in humans, that's an X and an X, which is girls, and an X and a Y, which is boys. So the other 22 pairs are the somatic chromosomes. The original theory of the oncogene or somatic mutation theory was a particular type of cancer, let's say prostate or breast or pancreatic or whatever, had a unique mutation in one of those chromosomes. And every case of prostate cancer had the same mutation, and that's what caused prostate cancer. The alternative was that the mutations were not specific to the type of cancer. In other words, there wasn't a prostate cancer mutation, but it was specific to that person's cancer. So every cancer cell in a person with prostate cancer would have the same mutation, which might be different than the next guy with prostate cancer, et cetera. But those were the two, foundational principles on which this whole endeavor was formulated. And when I say endeavor was formulated, I mean the trillions of dollars of cancer research, cancer institutions, cancer therapy, new drug development, and on and on and on that has gone into this. My understanding is it's probably the second biggest project that human beings have ever undertaken after war. So war is number one. Finding the cancer cure is number two. The problem is 40 years later, and this was highlighted by an oncologist who gave the keynote address at the American Oncology meeting. If you look at every individual with prostate cancer has completely different mutations. And every person in their own tumor, so cell A has, 3 mutations, cell B has 6,428 mutations, cell C has 103 mutations. Every cell is different. Every cancer from one person to another is different. And as he said, if somatic mutations are the cause, we're never going to be able to do anything about it because it's so complex that there's no way to make any sense out of this.
Is that the farm that we're still buying? Like, does the cancer fighting industry still think that's the way to approach it?
Yes. Billions and billions and hundreds of billions of dollars. They're almost all of them devoted to finding the next somatic mutation and hoping that's the one. The irony is after 40 years and trillions of dollars, most of the therapies that people do for cancer have nothing to do with somatic mutations. They just do surgery, radiation, and chemo that kills cells. Has nothing to do with it. There's about 3% of the current oncology treatments have anything to do with oncogenes, which we're talking about. It's like somebody invests $3 trillion in making a new product, and after 40 years, you say, "What do you got for me?" The guy said, "Well, nothing."
Right. And as I think you pointed out in your book, the success rate of these therapies, the surgery, chemo, and radiation is not very helpful, not very promising.
Well, and specifically, the surgery and the radiation is sort of different. Those are just basically cutting and burning out tumors. So, but the most of this effort has been towards chemotherapy or developing, medical agents for treating cancer. And the first fly in that ointment was a guy named Ulrich Abel in the early 90s, who was a German biostatistician who basically looked at every published study on the efficacy of chemo for stage 3 and 4 cancer, which is when most of the chemo is used, published in any peer-reviewed journal in the world. And he came to the conclusion that the benefit from chemotherapy in stage 3 and 4 epithelial cancers are breast, prostate, pancreas, the usual ones, not like lymphomas or leukemias. So in those cancers, the usual ones, the benefit of chemotherapy was 2.9% improvement. This was published, and he was roundly criticized for, everything from his character to whatnot. nobody ever disproved what he said, but, they went after him. So that was the first major study. And then in 2004, the Australian government decided to relook at this. And they did a similar thing and looked at the benefit of chemotherapy for all stages of cancer, all epithelial cancer. And they came to the conclusion that the benefit, and I can't remember which one is which, but in Australia it was 2.1%. In the United States, it was 2.3% improvement. And it may have been the other way around. I don't remember. But in other words, basically nothing. And nobody has disproven that or debunked that. They didn't go after the Australian government because they probably didn't know who to go after. But that's where we stand.
Well, it sounds like we are quite defeated in this war on cancer then.
That's not what I would say. That particular strategy, based on that particular philosophy, predictably went nowhere. But to me, that means, and essentially what I wrote the book about was that was the wrong conclusion. It was the wrong theory as to what causes cancer in the first place.
So you're not an oncologist. What makes you think you have an idea about what the right theory would be?
That's a good question. I'm definitely not an oncologist. I guess I'm just arrogant. So I think I can think and understand basic principles, and I gave it a shot. Although I would say one of my favorite quotes that I put in the front of my heart book, where I said the heart doesn't pump the blood and blocked arteries are not the main cause of heart attacks. One of the quotes I wrote in the front of the book was from one of my heroes, Victor Schauberger, who said, if I'm wrong about the water and the way water moves, then it's of no consequence that there's one more fool running around in the world. But if I'm right, then God help us all. So I guess that's my answer to this.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you have your opinion and you're arrogant and you're just going to put it out there. You do understand, and this is actually why we wanted you on the show. You do have a profound understanding of the human body and how it works. You've done your research. So talk to us about new approaches to cancer therapy that might have a better success rate.
The first fly in this ointment was, and this is just basic. So first of all, I thank you for that endorsement. But to me, it's fairly straightforward. So if you look at a cell, it has basically two parts. So if you draw an oval, then it has a nucleus in it, which is where the chromosomes and the genes are. So that's where the somatic mutations happen in the nucleus. And then around the nucleus, inside of the cell, there's a cytoplasm, which is the so-called watery part. And the cytoplasm, we're told, is basically a bag of water with stuff floating in it, stuff being ribosomes, mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, a bunch of different organelles, they're called. So those are the two parts of the cell, cytoplasm and nucleus. So as I referenced in the book, this has been done about 8 to 10 times. The references are all in my book, where people took two normal cells, and they can actually transplant the nucleus of one cell into the other cell. They take two normal cells, transplant the nucleus of the healthy cell into another healthy cell, and the progeny are healthy. So that's pretty straightforward. Mm-hmm. Then you take a cancer cell and a healthy cell, and you take the nucleus out of the cancer cell, and you put it into the healthy cytoplasm, and the progeny are normal, healthy. And then you do it the other way. You take a healthy cell and a normal cell, and you take the nucleus from the healthy cell and put it into the cancerous cytoplasm, and the progeny are cancer. So that simple experiment, which has been repeated and in the so-called peer-reviewed literature about 8 to 10 times, tells you very simply and straightforwardly that the problem with cancer is in the cytoplasm, not the nucleus, period. So it can't be the somatic mutation theory. The somatic mutations, it's not that there aren't somatic mutations, But the core of the problem, the cause of the problem, the origin of the problem has to be in the cytoplasm. And the thing that's so interesting about medical researchers and I guess human beings is they would do this experiment, essentially proving that the origin of cancer is in the cytoplasm. And then they would say, well, there must be something in the cytoplasm that can heal mutated genes, because they're so wedded, partly in their funding, to studying mutated genes, that even when they find that the mutated genes are not the origin of the problem, they postulate without any evidence that cytoplasm, a healthy cytoplasm, can somehow fix your genes. So, of course, that's nonsense. So the problem is in the cytoplasm. So then the question is, how does an unhealthy cytoplasm cause cancer? So for that, I proposed a theory as to how that happens. Of course, I don't really make these things up. It comes from my distillation of what I know and what I read about and study. But the way that I approached this was, so forget about what we think we know about cancer, but what do we see in a tumor? What do we see in a growth? And it would be easy, I think, for people to picture, say, a breast cancer, just because it's on the surface and you can feel it. Mm-hmm. So if you feel a breast, it feels normal, like a breast, which is soft and flexible. And then you keep moving your hand, and then you come to the tumor, the breast cancer, and it feels like a hard rock embedded in this otherwise normal tissue. And then you move away from it, and you're back to normal tissue. So normal, hard rock, then normal. So the question is, why does it feel hard? Why do all cancers feel hard? The answer is because there's too many cancer cells in each, square centimeter of tissue or millimeter. In other words, normal breast cells, normal breast tissue, normal pancreas tissue, normal, prostate tissue, the cells have a certain density, or as I like to call it, they have a certain spatial orientation. They connect with each other at a certain distance. Just interestingly, like human beings do. And sometimes I demonstrate this by, when I sit with a patient, I sit about 4 feet away from them. And I say, if you don't believe that spatial orientation changes everything, let's do the rest of this and I'll sit at the other side of the room. Everything else is the same. My clothes are the same, my words are the same, but it changes everything. Or how about this? What if I put my face 6 inches from your face and told you what I think? First of all, you'd probably run out of the room and think this guy's a nutcase. But it changes everything. And all I did was change the space. So in a tumor, the space has been changed. They're now piling up on top of each other. And that's why we see it as a tumor. That's why we feel it as a tumor. It's too dense. Mm-hmm. So the question then is, where does the density of the tissue come from? How does that originate in the first place? So here it gets into some interesting information, because the reason cells keep their distance is because all cells, in order to be living and connected to their environment, have to have a negative charge around them, like a halo of negative charges. And when the two negatively charged cells come together, they repel each other and keep their distance. And the density of the tissue, liver or breast or whatever, is dependent on the strength of that charge. So if it's a really strong charge, the cells are more separate. And if it's a weaker charge, the cells are more packed together. But they always have a certain spatial orientation that's unique to that tissue. In cancer cell, that spatial orientation is lost. There's no negative charge around the cell. The cells therefore clump together and lose their connection to the whole, and that's what we call cancer.
Coming up, Tom discusses that protective halo-like negative charge that needs to be around the cell to maintain its health and balance. He explains how it comes from the appropriate distribution of sodium and potassium ions in the cells. This, he says, is the charge of life, the energy of life.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
We have a simple way to learn more about the Wise Traditions lifestyle so you can have it at your fingertips at any time. There are 7 easy lessons available for free on our website. We kind of encapsulate what the principles are about so you can read about the basics and keep them handy. So sign up for them using the link in the show notes and enjoy. They are our free gift to you. And this episode is brought to you in part by grass-fed liver and bone marrow by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements makes New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, liver, and bone marrow in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Beef liver and bone marrow are the most effective foods to support health and wellness. These traditional foods were, and still are, fundamental to our biology. It's incredibly insightful to see how animals in the wild instinctively go for the liver and the bone marrow first, leaving the muscle meats for the birds. Even then, birds will be caught taking marrow bones high into the sky and dropping them onto the rocks in order to gain access to the inside. Liver and bone marrow provide concentrated amounts of vitamin A, choline, folate, B12, copper, heme iron, and fat-soluble activators that are now absent from the modern diet. This nourishment is known to support methylation and fundamental health. Visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. I've talked to a lot of experts about our need for this negative charge, this energy that helps our cells and mitochondria, which are the engines in the cells, to function properly. So where can we get that negative charge that our body so desperately needs?
Right. That negative charge is part of something that has been of interest to, scientists, doctors, biologists for hundreds of years, because the charge comes from the distribution of sodium and potassium across the membrane. And let me flesh that out a little bit. One of the central conundrums of biology and mammalian, human biology in particular, was we live in a sodium-rich environment, a salt-rich environment, yet the inside of our cells is low in sodium and high in potassium. And that distribution, low sodium inside, high potassium inside, high sodium outside, low potassium outside the cell, that creates the charge. Everybody agrees with that. So the question is, how does that come about? And one of the biggest achievements in medical research and biology and science was they discovered there's a sodium-potassium pump in the membrane that pumps the sodium out and the potassium in. That distribution of charge of ions, sodium, potassium, creates the charge, which is the charge of life, is the basic energy of life.
Low sodium, high potassium inside the cell, and high sodium, low potassium outside of it. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
It comes because of this pump.
Okay.
And then years ago, I read this book by a guy named Gilbert Ling, and he did a very simple experiment. He did it for 20 years, where he measured the amount of ATP, which is the so-called, but incorrectly called, energy of the cell. And he discovered that in order to do this pump, you would need 30 times the ATP necessary to run the entire cell just to run the pump. In other words, the pump, there is a pump, you can actually see it in some ways, but it's like a backup generator. It is in no way what causes this distribution. That fundamental tenet of biology is simply incorrect. So the question then is, what does cause this change of, this distribution of sodium potassium? Ling was also able to demonstrate that is the reason for that distribution is because all of the water in the cell is not in liquid water as we're told, but in a form of a crystalline gel. This crystalline gel has a certain matrix size. In other words, like a mesh size. It's like mosquito netting on your window. And the mosquito netting has to be big enough to let the air in and small enough to keep the mosquitoes out. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So the mesh in our cytoplasm, which is a mixture of proteins and water and ATP, which I can get to in a minute, is of a certain size. This is the sort of miracle of life. Water forms crystalline gels, which by themselves attach to potassium and exclude sodium. There's no energy required except the energy of making the gels. And once the gels are made, it attaches to potassium, excludes sodium, creates the charge, and that's how any cell gets its energy. That's how any cell gets its voltage. That's how any cells become alive. That's how any cell connects to the other cells. And that's the secret of life. And I just want to finish with one thing. So you could say, well, Tom, how do I know that? I mean, I know it from the studies of Ling and others now. But here's another way I know that. When an oncologist or any doctor wants to look for cancer, they do an MRI. That's one of the tests. So the question is, what does an MRI measure? And I didn't know that. Hardly anybody knows that. They just say, well, it measures the tumor or something. But it turns out that an MRI measures something called the relaxation phase of water in the cells. That is an intimate measurement of how crystalline or gelled the water in your cell is. When the relaxation phase increases, that means the crystalline gel is being distorted or dissolved or hardened, and that tells you that that's a cancer cell. So the very thing that we measure to determine whether this tissue is a tumor or not is actually the property of the crystallization of the water.
Okay, so I'm absorbing this, no water pun intended. I'm absorbing what you're saying. And so it's great that you've identified, along with, Ling and others, you've helping us all understand that we need the water to not crystallize. Is that right? Do we need the water to remain flexible and fluid so that our cytoplasm functions properly? The question is how we get it there.
Right. I think the better way to say it is the water in our cytoplasm is in the form of a crystalline gel.
Okay.
The more perfect the crystalline gel is, the better our health is.
Right. So we want to keep that crystalline gel perfect.
Yes.
That's the secret. We have to figure out
and
how to do that.
If we punch holes in it, if we dissolve it, if we harden it, then we're in trouble. So then you have to ask this. So I think the question you're asking is, how does this crystalline gel come about that's healthy, and what factors deteriorate it, right? That's the issue.
Right.
So there's a very simple experiment that you can do that will help answer that, because, and this I talked about in my heart book. So if you can imagine, so number one, all crystalline gels themselves have a negative charge. So if you take a beaker of water, right, just a plain beaker of water, and in that you dissolve, you put a, sorry, not dissolve, you put a horizontal, suspend a horizontal tube in that water, and the tube is hydrophilic. In other words, it will interact with water. So what happens is the inside of the tube will form this liquid, form this gel layer, which is negatively charged. And then the positive charges, the protons, will dissolve into the water part in the center of the tube. The protons, they repel each other and start flow. And I actually proposed in my heart book, that's what causes the blood in our body to move, because you have these tubes, and whenever you have a tube interacting with water, then you create a separation of charges. You create, positive ions dissolved in the water. They repel each other, and they get the blood moving. That's the basic reason blood moves in the body. So then you can experiment with this, and this is easily to measure. You can measure the flow rate. You can measure the voltage. The higher the voltage, the stronger and healthier the gel. You can measure the pH. Certain pHs mean the gel is formed. And you can see what influences the formation of these gels. So you take this beaker with the tube in it, you put it in a lead box, it stops flowing. You take it out of the lead box and you shine it in the sunlight, it starts flowing. You take it out of the lead box and you put it on the earth, there's an electromagnetic field from the earth, at least there used to be, and then it starts flowing. You put your hands on the beaker and it starts flowing because there's an electromagnetic field that creates gels just emanating from the palms of our hands. You put your dog next to it, at least most dogs, and it starts flowing. So you then realize, how does laying on of hands work? How does being in the sunshine work? How does earthing, connecting with the earth with your bare feet, how does that work? Because it stimulates the formation of gels, which are the basis of our circulation and the basis of the charge of our body. And then the answer to your question, what should you not do? You can put a cell phone next to the beaker and it will stop flowing. Because non-native electromagnetic fields, particularly of the type of things that are found in radar and dirty electricity and cell phones and wireless radiation, etc., all of them directly inhibit the proper formation of gels in our cells, which then affects circulation, affects detoxification. It affects the charge around the cell, which then facilitates cells clumping together, which is the origin of cancer.
I love what you're saying, Tom, because this advice is actually something that is a wise tradition that the Weston A. Price Foundation embraces and promotes, is getting in touch with the soil and getting sunlight and eating nutrient-dense food that has been in the sun. These are very natural things that we can incorporate into our lives that are going to benefit the cells that you're talking about and this crystallized gel, correct?
That's right, right. We human beings are, in a sense, creations of the interaction of the sun and the earth, or the heaven and the earth. And if we disconnect from that, we will suffer poor health, insofar as we connect to that, and we connect to that by the way we live and the food that we eat and, what's also in our hearts, then we can live a healthy life.
So we are going to have to do a part 2 because there's so much more to explore, in addition to discussing if a person is currently diagnosed with cancer, what approaches they might consider as opposed to the standard protocols that are out there. So as we wrap up, Tom, let me ask you one more question. I often pose this at the end, as you know. If the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
Get rid of all wireless devices and join the movement to stop 5G.
Powerful. Thank you so much for your time today, Tom.
Okay, thank you.
Our guest today was Dr. Tom Cowan. Visit his website, fourfoldhealing.com, for more information. And please share this episode on social media and subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a thing. You can find me at holistichilda.com. And that's it. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.